What if the biggest obstacle between you and the life you've always wanted isn't your circumstances, but the invisible prison inside your own mind? Think about that for a moment. Every single morning, you wake up in a cell you cannot see. The bars are made of thoughts you've repeated so many times they feel like truth. The walls are constructed from memories you've carried since childhood. The lock is a voice inside your head that whispers, "You're not enough. You're not ready. Who do you think you are?" And the most terrifying part? You hold the key. You've always held the key. But you've been so busy searching for answers outside yourself that you never noticed it was in your hand all along. There was a man named Daniel. And Daniel was drowning. Not in water. Not in debt. Not in any disaster you could point to on a map. Daniel was drowning in something far more common, far more invisible, and far more deadly than any storm the world could throw at him. He was drowning in the quiet desperation of a life half lived. Every morning, Daniel's alarm would scream at 6:15. He would reach over with the same robotic motion, slap the button, and lie there in the darkness, staring at the ceiling. The ceiling that had become his most familiar landscape. The ceiling that had witnessed more of his unfulfilled promises than any human being ever had. His apartment was small. Too small for a man his age. Too small for dreams as big as the ones he used to carry. Photographs lined the walls. Pictures of a younger Daniel, smiling. A Daniel who believed he would change the world. A Daniel who hadn't yet learned that hope was something the world would slowly drain out of you. There was a photograph from his college graduation. His mother's arm wrapped around him, her eyes shining with pride. She had worked double shifts for years so he could have a chance. She believed in him so fiercely it almost hurt to remember. And there was Daniel, holding his diploma, convinced that this was just the beginning. That was 12 years ago. Now, at 34, Daniel worked in a cubicle that smelled faintly of stale coffee and recycled air. His job title was Senior Account Manager, which was a fancy way of saying he managed the expectations of clients who would never be satisfied and the anxiety of a boss who would never be impressed. Every day followed the same script. He would sit in traffic, watching the brake lights of strangers, wondering if any of them had started their mornings with the same heaviness in their chest. He would park in the same spot. Walk through the same glass doors. Exchange the same hollow pleasantries with colleagues who knew nothing about his dreams and cared even less. "Good morning, Daniel." "Morning, Sarah. How are the kids?" "Busy as always." "You know how it is." He didn't know how it was. Not really. Daniel had never married. His last serious relationship ended 3 years ago when his girlfriend, a woman named Elena, finally said the words he had been dreading. "Daniel, you're not here. You're physically present, but you're not here. I'm tired of being with someone who's already given up." He had tried to argue. Tried to explain that he was just waiting for the right moment. Just waiting until he felt ready. Just waiting until he had more confidence. She had looked at him with a sadness that cut deeper than anger ever could. "Daniel, confidence isn't something you find. It's something you build. And you've been waiting for it to arrive like it's a package at your door. But it's not coming. It's never coming unless you start building it yourself." He remembered that conversation the way you remember a scar. Not because it hurt in the moment, but because it still hurts every time you notice it. The truth about Daniel was that he had spent his entire life waiting. Waiting to feel ready. Waiting to feel worthy. Waiting to feel confident. And while he waited, life moved on without him. His childhood friends had become doctors, lawyers, entrepreneurs. They had families. They had homes. They had the kind of lives that Daniel had once imagined for himself. His younger sister, Maria, had started her own bakery 3 years ago. He remembered the fear in her voice when she told him about her plans. the trembling in her hands as she signed the lease. The sleepless nights she spent wondering if she was making a terrible mistake. And he remembered the phone call, 2 years later, when she told him she had just opened her second location. "How did you do it, Maria? How did you have the courage?" She had laughed, the way people laugh when they've been through something hard and survived. "I didn't have courage, Daniel. I just had a dream that was bigger than my fear. And every day, I chose the dream." Daniel had hung up the phone and stared at his reflection in the window. He saw a man who had spent years avoiding failure. Who had spent years protecting himself from the pain of rejection. Who had spent years building walls so high that even hope couldn't climb over them anymore. But somewhere, buried deep beneath the layers of self-doubt and accumulated disappointment, there was still a flicker. A flicker of the boy who used to believe. A flicker of the young man who thought he could do anything. A flicker that had been starved of oxygen for so long it barely remembered how to burn. What Daniel didn't know was that the prison he was living in wasn't built by his circumstances. It was built by his beliefs. Every morning, Daniel would wake up and his first thought would be, "I'm so tired. And then, I have to do this all over again. And then, what's the point?" These thoughts felt like facts. They felt like reality. But they were nothing more than stories his mind had been telling him for so long they'd become automatic. The human brain has a remarkable ability. It will find evidence for whatever you believe to be true. This is called confirmation bias. If you believe you're not smart enough, your brain will search for every mistake you make and ignore every success. If you believe you don't deserve love, your brain will remember every rejection and minimize every moment of connection. If you believe you lack confidence, your brain will show you every moment of hesitation and forget every moment of courage. Daniel's brain had become an expert at finding evidence for his inadequacy. He would sit in meetings, and when someone asked for his opinion, his heart would race. His palms would sweat. His mind would go blank. He would think, "See? I don't have anything valuable to say." What he didn't notice was that this was a learned response. A habit. A pattern that had been reinforced over thousands of repetitions. Every time he avoided speaking up, his brain would release a small amount of relief. Ah, safety. No rejection. No judgment. No risk. And with that relief came a tiny dose of dopamine. The dopamine of avoidance. The dopamine of staying small. The dopamine of the familiar. This is the most dangerous drug there is. Because it doesn't feel like a drug. It feels like wisdom. It feels like prudence. It feels like protecting yourself. But all it's really doing is keeping you in a cage you could leave at any moment. There was one moment in Daniel's life that he could never forget. It was the moment that had broken something inside him. He was 26 years old. Fresh out of graduate school. Full of ideas and energy and the kind of naive optimism that only youth can provide. He had spent 6 months working on a project. A business plan. A detailed, meticulous, beautifully crafted business plan for a company he was going to start. It was going to revolutionize the way people learned new skills. It was going to make education accessible, personalized, and genuinely exciting. Daniel had worked on this plan in the evenings after his day job. He had skipped social events. He had foregone vacations. He had poured his entire soul into this dream. And then, one night, he had sent an email to a potential investor. He had written and rewritten the email 100 times. He had asked his friends to read it. His sister. Even his mother, who had never been to business school but who had a wisdom that came from surviving life. They had all told him it was brilliant. "Send it, Daniel. It's perfect." He had hovered his mouse over the send button for a full hour. His heart had pounded. His hands had trembled. His mind had offered 1,000 reasons to wait just one more day. Just one more revision. Just one more draft. I'll send it tomorrow when I'm feeling more confident. But something had pushed him forward. Some small flame of belief that had not yet been extinguished. He had clicked send. And then he had waited. The days that followed were torture. Every time his phone buzzed, his heart would leap into his throat. Every time he checked his email, he would feel a wave of anxiety wash over him. And then, 5 days later, the reply came. We appreciate your enthusiasm, but we don't feel this is the right fit for our portfolio at this time. We wish you the best of luck. Daniel had read those words over and over. He had dissected them. Analyzed them. Blamed himself for every possible mistake. If I had written the email differently. If I had been more specific. If I had been more confident. If I had been more everything. The rejection wasn't just a rejection of his idea. It was a rejection of his entire identity. It was proof, he told himself, that he was never meant to be anything more than what he already was. And so, Daniel did what so many people do when they experience rejection. He retreated. He built a smaller life. A safer life. A life where nothing could hurt him because nothing was ever really attempted. He stopped pitching ideas at work. He stopped pursuing creative projects. He stopped dating. He told himself he was being practical. Realistic. Sensible. But what he was really doing was protecting himself from the pain of ever being hurt again. Let me ask you something. Have you ever experienced a rejection so painful that you decided, consciously or unconsciously, to never risk being rejected again? Have you ever had a dream so big that someone laughed at it, and you decided to never speak of that dream again? Have you ever felt so embarrassed by a failure that you started making yourself smaller just to avoid the possibility of ever failing publicly again? If you have, then you understand Daniel. Because Daniel isn't just one person. Daniel is all of us. Every single person who has ever wanted something and felt they weren't good enough to get it. Every single person who has ever dreamed of something and convinced themselves they weren't capable of achieving it. Every single person who has ever looked at the life they're living and whispered to themselves, this isn't what I wanted. But something was about to change. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday. Daniel had just finished another soul-crushing day at work. He had spent 8 hours nodding along to other people's ideas, processing other people's requests, and trying to make himself invisible to his boss's critical eye. He was walking home through the city park, the same path he'd walked 1,000 times, when he noticed something unusual. An old man was sitting on a bench, feeding pigeons. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the way the old man was laughing. Genuine, wholehearted, belly-deep laughter. Daniel had almost forgotten what real laughter sounded like. The laughter he heard most days was the forced, hollow laughter of office politeness. The ha-ha, good one laughter. The I'm laughing because I'm supposed to laugh laughter. But this was different. This was the laughter of someone who had discovered a secret. Daniel slowed his pace. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was exhaustion from the day. Maybe it was some buried part of himself that still remembered what joy felt like. The old man looked up at him with eyes that seemed to see everything. You look like a man who's forgotten how to laugh, the old man said. Daniel stopped. He wanted to be offended. He wanted to walk away. But something kept him rooted to the spot. I've had a long day, Daniel said. Has it been long, the old man said, or have you been afraid? Daniel blinked. I'm sorry. You can tell a lot about a person's life by what they avoid, the old man said. And you, my friend, have been avoiding something for a very long time. Daniel felt his chest tighten. How could this stranger see so much? What makes you say that? Daniel asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Because you walk like a man carrying a weight that doesn't belong to him. You stand like you're trying to take up as little space as possible. And when you looked at me just now, your first instinct was to look away. Daniel wanted to deny it. He wanted to argue. But the old man was right. Sit with me, the old man said. And despite every instinct telling him to keep walking, Daniel sat. The old man was named Arthur. He was 82 years old. He had been a businessman, a musician, a father, a widower, a traveler, and, he said, a man who had spent most of his life being afraid. You're young, Arthur said. You think you have time. But time is not a bank account you can make deposits into. Time is a river that only flows in one direction. And you've been standing on the shore, watching it go by. Daniel said nothing. Tell me, Arthur continued, what is it you're most afraid of? Daniel wanted to say, nothing. He wanted to laugh it off. He wanted to pretend he was fine. But something about Arthur's eyes made pretense impossible. I'm afraid. I'm afraid I've wasted my life, Daniel said. The words hung in the air between them. It was the first time he had ever said them out loud. The first time he had ever admitted to another human being that he was terrified of the person he had become. Arthur nodded slowly. Good, he said. That's a good thing to be afraid of. Daniel stared at him. How is that good? Because it means you're not dead yet. It means something inside you is still fighting. It means there's still a part of you that believes there's more to life than what you've settled for. Daniel felt tears forming in his eyes. He hadn't cried in years. He had told himself that crying was weakness. That strong men don't cry. But here, on this bench, with a stranger who seemed to understand him better than anyone ever had, the tears came anyway. I don't know how to change, Daniel whispered. And that's the first honest thing you've said to me, Arthur said. But I don't think you're afraid of change. I think you're afraid of failure. And I think the reason you're afraid of failure is because you've confused your failures with who you are. Arthur was talking about something that psychologists call the fundamental attribution error. It's the tendency to interpret other people's behavior as a reflection of their character, while interpreting our own behavior as a reflection of our circumstances. When someone else fails, we think, they must not be good enough. When we fail, we think, the situation was unfair. But more than that, we also do the opposite. When someone else succeeds, we think, they must have gotten lucky. When we succeed, we think, I earned this. This is how our minds protect our egos. And it's how we stay trapped. Because when you believe that failure is a reflection of your fundamental worth as a human being, you will do anything to avoid it. You will play small. You will play safe. You will live a life that doesn't even come close to your potential. Daniel had been doing this for years. Every time he failed at something, he interpreted it as evidence that he was a failure. Every time he was rejected, he interpreted it as evidence that he was rejectable. Every time he felt fear, he interpreted it as evidence that he was weak. But here's the thing about failure. Failure is not who you are. Failure is data. Failure is information. Failure is the universe telling you, this approach didn't work. Try something different. But Daniel had been treating failure like a verdict. A final judgment. A life sentence. Arthur told Daniel a story. When I was 25, Arthur said, I had a dream. I wanted to be a musician. I wanted to play jazz on stages around the world. I could play the piano better than anyone I knew. I could feel music in my bones. It was the only time I ever felt truly alive. Daniel leaned in. He could feel the passion in Arthur's voice. One night, I was playing in a small club. A record producer was in the audience. I had been waiting for this moment my entire life. I played my heart out. I played with more emotion and skill than I had ever played before. I just knew, that this was my moment. Arthur paused. And what happened? Daniel asked. He came up to me after the show. I'll never forget the look on his face. He said, "You have talent, kid. Real talent. But you're trying too hard to be perfect. You're so afraid of making a mistake that you're not taking any risks. And music without risk is just noise." Arthur laughed, shaking his head. That rejection broke me. For years, I couldn't play a single note without hearing his voice in my head. "You're too careful. You're too safe. You're not taking risks." I stopped playing altogether. Daniel felt a deep recognition. He knew exactly what that felt like. The voice of criticism that becomes louder than your own voice. "How did you start playing again?" Daniel asked. Arthur smiled. "I met someone who reminded me that I wasn't playing for the producer. I wasn't playing for the audience. I wasn't even playing for the approval of anyone else. I was playing because music was the only thing that made me feel fully alive. And I realized that as long as I was breathing, I had a choice. I could live a life of fear, or I could live a life of music. Confidence is not the absence of fear. That's the most important thing Daniel had to learn. Confidence is not a switch that you flip and suddenly everything becomes easy. Confidence is a choice you make every single day to act despite your fear. There was a moment in Daniel's life that he had never shared with anyone. It was the moment he started avoiding himself. He had been driving home from work on a Friday evening. The sun was setting. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple. It was the kind of beauty that usually made him feel something. But that night, he felt nothing. He looked at the sun setting and thought, "Another day gone. Another day I'll never get back." And then he looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. And he didn't recognize the face staring back at him. The face of a man who had given up. The face of a man who had stopped believing in anything. The face of a man who was already dead but hadn't stopped breathing. Daniel pulled over to the side of the road and sobbed. He sobbed for all the dreams he had abandoned. He sobbed for all the years he had wasted. He sobbed for the boy who used to believe. And when the tears finally stopped, Daniel made a decision. He couldn't go on like this. He couldn't spend another day living a life that felt like a prison. He couldn't spend another day pretending that he was okay when he was drowning. So he decided to change. But change is not a single moment. Change is 1,000 small decisions made over time. Daniel didn't wake up the next morning as a new person. He woke up with the same fears. The same doubts. The same racing heart. The same voice in his head telling him that he wasn't good enough. But this time, he did something different. He wrote down a single sentence in a notebook. "I am not my fear. I am the person who chooses to act despite my fear." It felt silly. It felt like something from a self-help book he would normally mock. But he did it anyway. And then he made another decision. He wrote down a small goal. "Today, I will speak up once in the meeting. Even if my voice shakes. Even if I'm not sure what to say." And then he did it. He went to work, and when his boss asked for input on a project, Daniel opened his mouth. His heart was pounding. His throat was dry. His hands were trembling. But he spoke. He said, "I think we could improve this approach by." And the world didn't end. No one laughed. No one rejected him. No one called him an idiot. His boss nodded, considered his suggestion, and said, "That's a good point." Let's think about that. Daniel sat back in his chair, his heart still racing, but now it was racing with something else. It was racing with something that felt almost like hope. The problem with building confidence is that you have to keep building it. It's not like a destination you arrive at. It's like a muscle you have to keep exercising. Daniel learned this the hard way. After his first success in the meeting, he felt great. For a whole day, he walked around with his head held high. He thought, maybe I can do this. Maybe I can change. But then the next morning arrived. And the voice was back. Yesterday was a fluke. You're going to fail today. You're not really capable of change. Daniel felt his heart sink. He had been so hopeful. He had thought he had turned a corner. He had thought the hardest part was over. But the hardest part wasn't over. The hardest part was just beginning. This is what happens when you try to change. Your brain has spent years building neural pathways that support your current behavior. Every time you act in a certain way, those pathways get stronger. They become like well-worn paths in a forest. And when you try to walk a new path, your brain resists. It's harder. It's uncomfortable. It feels wrong. This is why so many people give up on their goals. They have one good day, and then they have a bad day, and they think, see? I can't change. It's hopeless. But it's not hopeless. The resistance you feel is not a sign that you should give up. It's a sign that you're building something new. Daniel had setbacks. He had days when he didn't speak up. He had days when he felt so anxious he couldn't leave the apartment. He had days when he looked in the mirror and saw the same defeated person he'd always been. But here's what he did differently. When he had a setback, he didn't interpret it as a failure. He interpreted it as data. Why did I freeze in that meeting today? Because I was afraid my idea would be rejected. What was I really afraid of? That I would be seen as incompetent. Is that true? Have I actually been seen as incompetent, or is that just my fear talking? This process of questioning his own thoughts was the most powerful tool Daniel had ever discovered. It's a technique that psychologists call cognitive restructuring. It's the process of identifying irrational beliefs and replacing them with more realistic ones. When Daniel told himself, I can't do this, I'm not confident enough, he learned to challenge that belief. Is that actually true? Is it true that I can't do this? Or is it true that I'm afraid to try? He would ask himself. What's the evidence for this belief? What's the evidence against it? If someone I cared about had this belief, what would I tell them? What's a more balanced way to think about this? The answers surprised him. Often, there was very little evidence for his negative beliefs. And plenty of evidence against them. He had spoken up in meetings before. He had contributed valuable ideas. He had done many things that required courage. The only thing holding him back was his own mind. Over the weeks and months that followed, Daniel began to change. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't overnight. But it was real. He started taking small risks. He went for a run, even though he felt self-conscious about his body. He joined a writing group, even though he was terrified of having his words read aloud. He asked a woman out for coffee, even though his heart pounded so hard he could barely speak. Each small act of courage made the next one a little easier. Each small victory gave him evidence that he was capable of more than he had believed. The voice in his head changed. Instead of saying, "You're not good enough," it started saying, "You might be good enough if you keep trying." Instead of saying, "You're going to fail," it started saying, "Failure isn't fatal. You can try again." Instead of saying, "You're not confident," it started saying, "Confidence is something you build, and you're building it now." This is the secret of confidence that Daniel finally understood. Confidence is not something you feel. Confidence is something you do. You will never wake up one morning and suddenly feel confident. You will never get to a place where you're not afraid. You will never become a person who doesn't have doubts. But you can become a person who acts despite those doubts. You can become a person who takes a deep breath and steps forward anyway. You can become a person who understands that fear is not a sign to stop. Fear is a sign that you're doing something that matters. Fear is a sign that you're growing. Fear is a sign that you're alive. Daniel never became the person he thought he would be when he was younger. He didn't become a billionaire. He didn't become famous. He didn't achieve the kind of success that the world writes articles about. But he became something far more important. He became someone who no longer needed the world's approval to feel worthy. He became someone who had learned to say, "This is who I am, and that is enough." He became someone who had learned to take up space in the world without apologizing for his existence. And he discovered something that surprised him. When he stopped needing everyone else to validate him, he started connecting with them more deeply. When he stopped pretending to be someone he wasn't, people started responding to him more genuinely. When he stopped trying to impress everyone, he started impressing himself. There was a moment, about a year after Daniel had first sat on that bench with Arthur, when he realized how much he had changed. He was standing in front of a group of people, giving a presentation. His hands weren't trembling. His voice wasn't shaking. His heart was beating steady and calm. And he realized that the person standing there wasn't the same person who had been drowning in that cubicle. This person was someone who had fought for his own life. This person was someone who had refused to give up on himself. This person was someone who had built something worth building. After the presentation, a young woman came up to him. She had the same look in her eyes that Daniel had once had. The look of someone who was barely holding on. "How did you do it?" she asked. "How did you become so confident?" Daniel looked at her. He remembered the question he had asked his sister years ago. "How did you have the courage?" And he realized that he had the answer. "Confidence isn't something you find," he said. "It's something you build. And it takes time. It takes practice. It takes failure. It takes getting back up when you fall. It takes showing up every single day, even when you don't feel like it. Even when you're afraid. Even when you're sure you're going to fail." The young woman nodded. "But how do you start?" she asked. And Daniel smiled. "You start right now. With one small action. With one tiny step outside your comfort zone. And then you do it again tomorrow. And again the day after that. And eventually, you look back and you realize that you're not the person you used to be." The truth is that all of us are on this journey. All of us have fears. All of us have doubts. All of us have that voice in our heads telling us we're not good enough. The question is not whether you have that voice. The question is what you do with it. Do you listen to it? Do you let it control your life? Do you let it keep you in a cage you could leave at any moment? Or do you recognize that the voice is not the truth? It's just a voice. It's just a pattern of thoughts that you've practiced for so long it feels like reality. But it's not reality. Reality is that you are capable of so much more than you believe. Reality is that you have the power to change your life, starting right now. Reality is that the only thing standing between you and the person you want to become is your willingness to act despite your fear. Let me tell you what Daniel learned during his journey. He learned that confidence is not about being sure of yourself. It's about being willing to be uncertain. It's about being willing to make mistakes. It's about being willing to look foolish. It's about being willing to try, fail, and try again. He learned that the people he admired most were not people who had never failed. They were people who had failed more times than anyone else and kept going anyway. He learned that every great achievement in history was built on a foundation of countless failures. He learned that the greatest risk in life is not taking any risks at all. He learned that the prison he was living in was made of his own thoughts. And he learned that he had the key all along. Look at your own life for a moment. Look at what you've been avoiding. Look at what you've been telling yourself you can't do. Look at where you've been playing small. Look at where you've been settling. Now ask yourself, is that truly who you are? Or is that just who you've become because you were too afraid to become who you could be? The answer is in your hands. It always has been. It always will be. The only question is, what are you going to do about it? Daniel went back to that park bench one more time. He wanted to thank Arthur. He wanted to tell him about everything that had changed. But when he got there, the bench was empty. An old woman was sitting nearby, feeding the pigeons. "Excuse me," Daniel said. "Do you know the man who usually sits here?" "An old man named Arthur." The woman looked up at him with sad eyes. "Arthur passed away last month," she said. Daniel felt his heart sink. "He was my husband," she continued. "He used to love talking to people on this bench. He said it was his mission to remind people that they were capable of more than they believed." Daniel sat down on the bench. He looked at the pigeons pecking at the ground. He thought about everything Arthur had taught him. And he realized that Arthur's legacy wasn't in his words. It was in the lives he had touched. It was in the people he had inspired. It was in Daniel, who was now living a life he never thought possible. And that's the final lesson. Confidence is not just for you. When you build your confidence, you inspire others to build theirs. When you overcome your fears, you show others that they can overcome theirs. When you live your life fully, you give others permission to live theirs. So this is for you. Whoever you are. Wherever you are. Whatever you've been through. You are capable of more than you believe. You are stronger than you think you are. You are worthy of the life you want. And the only thing standing in your way is the voice in your head that tells you otherwise. But that voice is not the truth. It's just a voice. And you can choose to ignore it. You can choose to act despite it. You can choose to become someone who builds confidence every single day. You can choose to become someone who takes up space in the world. You can choose to become someone who lives a life that actually matters. Potential is never lost because of a lack of talent. It is lost one excuse at a time, one postponed dream at a time, one comfortable day after another. The life you want is waiting. Not for a better version of you, but for the decision you make today. Right now. In this moment. You have the key. You always have. Now use it.